So welcome everyone. Back from coffee break. So my name is Max TAVONI, and I'll be chairing this session, the second session just before lunch. The main topic is scenario analysis in an insecure, fragmented world. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious to everyone what extent fragmentation, economic fragmentation and social political fragmentation is becoming a big issue and also of high relevance for energy and climate change. And to try to understand how we can navigate this world and still attain the objectives that we discussed also in previous sessions around climate policies and good and sound climate policies, we have put together a panel together with the steering committee of the Integrated Assessment and Modeling Consortium of with three speakers from three international organizations, a discussant, and then we're going to open up for Q&As. So our three speakers are from IMF, World Bank, and IEA, respectively. We have James ROAF from IMF, who is Assistant Director in Fiscal Affairs Departments, working on climate change. IMF is progressively moved also towards climate change, including also modeling work. And David Groves, who is a Senior Climate Specialist at the World Bank, also in the climate unit. And then we have online from Paris, Araceli Fernandez Pallet, who is the head of Technology Innovation Unit, and she will give a remark online. Hi, Araceli, we can see you, and hope everything is fine. Followed by a discussion initiated and started by Brian O'Neill, who is the Chief Scientist at the Joint Global Research Institute here in the University of Maryland and PNNL. So without further delay, I'll give the floor first to James. You have 15 minutes each for remarks for your three plenary talks, then to Brian, and then to Q&As. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Massimo. Thanks, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and very happy to be here with the IEA and the World Bank, who are institutions that we work extremely closely with. And I'm particularly honored to be speaking to this community of modelers, because the first thing I would say is I'm not a modeler myself, but I'm here to represent colleagues who do a lot of modeling and apply the modeling. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we do mitigation analysis in the fund using this CPAT model, which I'll talk a bit about. Let me see if this is going to work. Yeah, here we go. So I'm going to talk quickly about the IMF role on climate, which is all about macroeconomics. I'm going to talk, but most of the talk I want to talk about this model, the climate policy assessment tool, which is a joint IMF World Bank model, and how we apply that tool, country level analysis, global analysis, and particular topics like, for example, the recent energy price surge. And finally, I'll talk a bit about complementarities with the broader modeling community. So the IMF has really stepped up a lot on climate. I moved into this role. I'm coordinating climate policies for the Fiscal Affairs Department, which is probably the largest part of climate work is fiscal in the fund. I started 2.5 years ago when there was one person working full-time on climate in the IMF. We now have, I think, about probably 30 people full-time on climate, and many people across the whole fund in country teams and all the different departments of the fund working on climate as part of their job. So it's really been a complete change over the past couple of years in how we treat climate. And I think that's really a recognition that climate is a macroeconomic issue, and therefore it's an issue for the IMF. It's both macroeconomics in terms of the effect climate is having and is going to have on countries' economies, but particularly macroeconomic in terms of the policies that countries need to take to address climate change. Mitigation policies, adaptation policies. So these are macro policies. These require the involvement of central banks. They require the involvement of ministries of finance. And these, of course, are our principal interlocutors in countries. So I think this recognition has come it came a little late maybe to the fund, but it's really come in force at this point. So we're very closely engaged in climate issues from that perspective. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these areas, just to say that mitigation is probably the main part of our work still, but we're developing work on adaptation, these other areas, climate finance, financial sector policies about climate, and fossil fuel exporters and so on. We're involved in supporting countries in different ways, and we're doing a lot of global analysis of issues like border adjustment or energy subsidies and things like this that are of interest and importance to our membership. We're also very closely involved in all of these global coordination, the G7, G20, the traditional things that the IMF has always been involved with, and now climate is becoming more and more up the agenda in those fora as well. Now, I'm going to talk mostly about mitigation today. This chart sort of shows our approach, if you like, to mitigation policy. You see carbon pricing at the center there. You won't be surprised, but we do regard it as the first best policy approach, but we recognize that it's never the only policy approach. You always need complementary sectoral policies, and B, very often it's not a feasible approach at all for political or social reasons that the countries haven't been able yet to put carbon pricing in place, and therefore you need to think about the alternative policies. I'll talk a bit more about how we look at that with this tool, but also all the other ancillary issues around mitigation policies, like competition issues for industries, or just transition issues for households or regions which are affected by climate policies. So to get into the model itself, let me stress, particularly with David here, that this is a joint product of the IMF and World Bank, the Climate Policies Assessment Tool. This has been developed over a number of years between our two teams. And this is a model that we currently have calibrated for about 170 countries. So basically, all of CO2 emissions are covered by this model. We're able to do emissions projections by sector, look at the reductions that are needed in order for countries to hit their NDCs, look at different instruments, carbon pricing, as I said, but also these other instruments, alternative instruments that countries could be following, and it produces outputs on emissions, on fiscal outcomes, so the revenues from policies and revenues and costs, welfare effects. Importantly, the co-benefits. We have modules in it which look at co-benefits, and these are all calibrated to the individual countries that are covered. Co-benefits, of course, these are mostly health from local air pollution, but also things like congestion and so on. And another very important aspect of this that we can look at is the incidence. So we look at household, industry incidence of mitigation policies to look at the distributional effects. It's a reduced form model mostly. Which I think is helpful for us in talking to our country authorities, because we're talking to non-climate experts in central banks, in ministries of finance, and having a very clear and transparent model where you can explain exactly how these effects are working through is very helpful for that. We are able to use projections of business as usual, and then we model the policy responses on that, looking at price changes, fuel price elasticities, and so on. Now, I think a key element of this model is that it is deliberately parameterized to be kind of in the center of the literature. We don't want to have a model, if we're advising a country, we want to have a model which we can say, this is encapsulating, the best we can of the modeling world out there. So we try to keep it in all the elasticity estimates and so on in the middle of the literature, and that's where where I think the model sort of relates to this broader community, is in trying to reflect that, so that we are able to tell our countries that this is this is really the best we can get from the literature. So I'll talk a bit more about that at the end. Now, I mean, it's not complete yet. It doesn't have forestry, agriculture, trade is not in the model, and capital dynamics are not. Now, just to give you an example, this is what the sort of the front end looks like. So you can customize this and produce all sorts of different analysis and charts that come out from the model. Now, I'm going to talk quickly about some ways we use this. First of all, at the individual country level. So here is a very simple chart of the G20 countries. This is with the high income, middle income, and lower income G20 countries grouped into three groups there. Just looking at carbon pricing, if we have simple carbon pricing, $25 carbon pricing is the light green bars. the effect on emissions and the revenues that you're getting from these. And then as you go up, $50, $75, just to give you an example of how we can just do these different modeling of emissions by countries, of different carbon pricing by countries. And of course, you see that that you're going to have larger effects on the poorer countries for a given carbon price. Then we can look at welfare effects. Here's an example of how welfare effects. This is coming from a model of a scenario which would hit the 2-degree Paris target. So and this is done in a way to try to be a little equitable. So we have a much higher carbon price for advanced countries than for the poorer countries. And how the welfare effects come in. So you have negative effects coming from the pure mitigation policy. This is, the technological cost of taking on more expensive technologies. You have fiscal effects, which could be either positive or negative, generally positive for poorer countries from the revenue recycling. And then very importantly, these co-benefits, which tend to be very large for a lot of the developing countries. So if you add up all these different welfare effects, in here, the white dots are showing you positive effects for most of the poorer countries. Most emerging market and developing countries are already at positive effects. And this, I would stress, is before even taking into account the climate externality. Of course, if you say, okay, this is going to hit the 2 degrees and we're going to have a big welfare effect from not from actually meeting our climate goals, then everybody would be further to the right, if you like. The welfare is even further. But this is just for at the individual country level, looking at from their own domestic point of view, what the welfare effects are. So that's an example of individual country work. Another one is this distributional effect. Here, looking at a few countries with different carbon pricing. Here we're modeling different approaches to compensate poorer households for increases in carbon prices. So if you have the carbon price, obviously that's going to put a cost on everybody. But if you then compensate the poorer households with direct cash transfers or with adjustments to labor tax schedules, you can see that it's quite easy to make a package of this, which has a net positive effect for the lower households. This is, here we have, in fact, we turn this into a very progressive package. And you can model, this is just to show an example of how you can model different packages to overcome any concern about progressivity in the carbon in the carbon price effects. Sorry, concerns about regressivity, and to turn it into a progressive altogether policy package. Finally, looking at other instruments, I mentioned carbon pricing versus other instruments. We've recently done a paper with the OECD looking at equivalence of different prices. And here, I won't go into the details of this, but we look at the sectoral reductions. This is vehicles, which I'm showing here, and the sectoral carbon price that would be equivalent to these sort of policies like EV subsidies or vehicle emission rate standards. And you can see some of these sectoral carbon price equivalents in the middle chart can be very large, as we know, for these hard to abate sectors. And then we can add them up at the economy-wide level and look altogether what a package of different approaches to mitigation can all add up to. Now, coming to the global, so that was all sort of at the individual country level. Now, if we come to how we use the tool for global analysis, well, the chart on the left, I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of chart showing you how emissions have been evolving in past, where the black dashed line going up is where they would be under a business as usual schedule, compared to the green lines where they need to be to get to sort of 1.5 to 3 to 2 degrees. The NDCs, that's the red dashed line in the middle there, are getting some of the way there, but obviously not nearly enough. And so we're looking here at modeling different scenarios to get into that green area. And so we have different scenarios, a different allocation between different country groupings. And again, we can do this different ways, but we're doing this here by income level. So we're different help effort between the rich countries, the middle income, and the poorer countries to see how that would pan out, and trying to help inform a debate among countries as to how they want to achieve these goals. if indeed they do want to achieve, which we hope. So here is just sort of breaking into that a little bit, looking at the carbon prices that go along with these scenarios and the welfare effects that go along with those carbon prices and those mitigation policies. Again, at crude sort of income level comparisons of richer, poorer, and the low-income countries. But again, you can see that in all these cases, once you take account of the co-benefits, you have very significant positive welfare effects actually across all of the emerging market countries. It's only the advanced countries in the deep purple there that you see some negative effects, but very, very manageable levels altogether. Looking at the recent energy price surge is another example of how this model's been used. I won't go to the detail, I won't spend long on this, but obviously in Europe, the effect on households of energy price increases has depended a huge amount on the energy mix of the country, particularly how much gas they have in their energy mix. So we have that all modeled within CPAT. This is all available within the model, so it's very easy to run these different scenarios and look at different energy price effects within the model. We can also look at what would be sort of, looking forward would be a good policy response to this going forward. It's difficult to talk about carbon pricing right now in Europe when energy prices are so high, but we think that there is an opportunity to gradually bring carbon pricing in over the next few years as energy prices recede. And you can see from the dashed lines, the sort of energy prices that would be needed going forward would obviously coal prices need to come up a lot more. The problem, if you like, with the latest energy price surge in Europe is it's all been in gas and not nearly enough in coal. But gas prices would remain still, well below recent peaks, even in 2030, under this sort of scenario with a carbon price coming in. So we hope that this will be something which will become more politically acceptable over the coming years. So just to conclude, I wanted to get back to the relationship with this conference and the community of modelers, because this CPAT is it's really it is reflecting, as I said, the community of modelers and the models that are out there, and it sort of lives or dies on the work that you all do, and so I think that that's very important for us to keep being able to develop this model and to reflect in it the advances that people are making in the modeling community. I think it's a simple model which helps policymakers to understand what these models are saying and how to interpret these models and how to use how to think about mitigation policies. Using this reduced form model. I think it's useful because it has a lot of this data in it. We have the energy price data from the IAEA and others. We have everything calibrated, so it's something that is very usable and available to people to use. And it has all these features like the co-benefits and the incidence analysis, which I think is very relevant to the policy debate. In terms of what we need going forward, I think we're very keen to see more analysis that can help inform our policy dialogue, particularly countries like China, India, the US, an analysis of the IRA and how that works. It's not very easy to sort of do in this model. So how to think about those kind of policies and how we can integrate that into our modeling, I think we're very interested in. A lot of debate, including within the IMF itself, about the GDP effects from climate policies. What happens to investment in China when they introduce a carbon price, that kind of thing. So I think we're very interested to see more modeling and to be part of that discussion with you all in that kind of area. And in emerging technologies, where we think about how to reflect these technologies in modeling going forward. So finally, this is just a few of the reports that we've done using CPAT. They're all available on our website. And I would finish by saying that CPAT is going to be available very soon. I think early in the new year, we're going to be publishing the model. So we're really looking forward to people using it and the reactions that you all have in using it. And we will further, hopefully improve it further from that. So with that, let me finish and pass on.
Thank you. Thanks, James. Thank you for being on time. Next is David Gross.
All right. Morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Really a pleasure to be here to represent the World Bank and present some new research from our new country climate development reports, or CCDRs. This is a new talk for me, so I'm going to probably read my remarks just to make sure I hit the high points and don't waste your time. So let me figure out how to advance the slides. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the World Bank CCDRs. So these are country-specific assessments of climate and development challenges and opportunities. And this map shown here, shows the 29 countries covered by the first installment of CCDRs. And these CCDR reports, most of them were released in the few weeks leading up to the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And so each report was developed by an interdisciplinary World Bank team drawn from their respective country offices, as well as global practice units. So this includes energy, transportation, macroeconomics, trade, and investment. And the report cover on the left is from an accompanying synthesis report, which was also just produced. And that's the source of the findings that are going to be shown, that I'm going to show here. So an important feature of the CCDRs is that they're focused on individual countries. Each report reviews their specific development goals, climate conditions and hazards, their current climate commitments from their national policies, nationally determined contributions, and other international commitments, assessments of macroeconomic conditions with and without climate action, and lastly, detailed sector analyses of climate risks, adaptation needs, and mitigation opportunities. So, of course, so much of the physical, social, and economic processes in play are uncertain. So developing these CCDRs is really an exercise in decision-making under deep uncertainty. So because of that, the CCDRs use scenarios to account for future uncertainty. They use scenarios to help structure the CCDR analyses. And so our global team developed guidance on how to use scenarios to represent two things. First, different socioeconomic and technology conditions for policy assessments. And second, physical changes for climate change impact assessments. And so we defined three global narratives ranging from a pessimistic case in which only recent climate policies are implemented, leading to highly dangerous warming, say around +4 degrees C, to an optimistic case in which successful decarbonization limits warming to plus 1.5 degrees C, or about there. And so to harmonize the various sector and economic modeling around common assumptions consistent with these narratives, we turn to the work of this community and the NGFS and IPCC CMIP scenarios for estimates of these key drivers. And this table just shows the specific scenarios we recommend and that the country teams used. And then we compared different national greenhouse gas emission pathways across these scenarios to evaluate the risks and opportunities of low carbon development, as well as comparing different national resilience investments across a corresponding range of global climate conditions. And through this kind of 2x2 matrix, we were able to infer a lot about what the costs and benefits of mitigation and adaptation in an uncertain global environment. So I'd like to present now a few of the high-level emerging results that have come out of this first batch of CCDRs. And so just really important, it's important to acknowledge or recognize that these are results generalized across country income groups, but the underlying results and analysis was performed at the country level, which of course is one of the important aspects of CCDRs. And so I'm presenting these results for two reasons. First, I think it's helpful for you all to see the kind of climate and development conclusions that the development community, the World Banks and other MDBs are looking for to guide our country investment and policy support. But second, this hopefully will generate some interest within this community for being more involved with the World Bank with these assessments going forward. So we're going to continue developing CCDRs for all of our 144 partner countries and then revise them every 5 years. And we're only 30 reports in. So all right. So the first main message of the synthesis of the CCDRs is just a confirmation that, of course, we all know this, that climate change, is creating, huge impacts on our and challenges for our development objectives, especially for poverty reduction. The CCDRs have explored many ways through which climate change will impact people, economies, and development prospects. But they can't cover all the impacts, of course. But already the assessments of the impacts that we did cover show some real risks that the countries are exposed to, but also the potential that adaptation policies can have to reduce the losses and protect people. So up to 12%. This is even though CCDRs can't cover all impacts, but already the assessments show, that the risks, there are significant risks to their development. So based on sectoral analysis, looking at water, agriculture, disaster risks, labor productivity, and other issues, some of the CCDRs assessed the effect of potential impacts of climate change on GDP. These analyses are partial and stop at 2050 before the largest impact materialize, but already we find that a significant impact on GDP, especially for lower income countries, with losses up to 12% in some countries and some scenarios. But these impacts are not written in stone, obviously. The adaptation options explored in the Sahel CCDR, for instance, shows that those adaptations could reduce or could improve GDP by 2 to 5% over without adaptation. And in some cases, for higher income countries, mostly some adaptation options could even lead to a net increase in GDP. And this is really thanks to all the co-benefits that they bring. The previous talk mentioned some of those. So second, the CCDRs also then explored low carbon development pathways. How do we mitigate climate change? And we show that emissions reductions can be achieved without compromise on development. But this is only possible if a number of key conditions are met. So here are some results. Together, the CCDR low carbon development pathways reduce greenhouse gas emissions by about 70% by 2050. So these are bottom-up assessments, not top-down. And so when you look at all the assessments together, we see that together their most aggressive scenario points to 70% decline. And this is really because the CCDRs depend on country context, including climate commitments, income level, potential for renewable energy, or other land-based emission reductions and development, domestic development priorities. In upper middle income countries, the low carbon development scenarios achieve large emission decreases, putting countries on track towards net zero in the decades after 2050. That's what this graph is showing. But emission reductions are smaller in lower middle income countries, and they depend a lot on the context and country commitments. So, and then furthermore, most low income countries, CCDRs, did not actually evaluate a specific low income development pathway this time around, as these countries, obviously they emit very little, and their CCDRs were focused on resilience and adaptation. Of course, as we go forward, we're going to need to look at emissions from our lowest income countries and make sure that their development is on path with net zero. So taken together, the CCDR scenario, or the scenarios within our CCDRs, show 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year emitted in 2050. So this is a major decline compared to current trends, but obviously it's still too high to achieve net zero at the global scale. There are large uncertainties on the scenarios post-2040, so it's expected that this will change over time. However, it shows that ambition will have to increase over time, including with more support from higher income countries. And it also reemphasizes the need for rapid emissions decline in higher income countries. So let's look at some of the impact of this climate action on our countries. So -1 to 3.3%. This is the impact on economic growth in 2030 from climate impacts, from climate actions. It shows that the emission reductions can be reconciled with economic growth and development. And, in fact, climate action does not lead to any significant declines in growth for our CCDR countries by 2030. And in many cases, it leads to, or it actually accelerates growth. The impacts on consumption, however, the bottom half of this graph can be larger, and this shows the importance of accessible and affordable external financing to support this transition, and the need to protect the poorest from any negative distributional effects. And note that this analysis was done without increasing external support. So I mentioned these positive outcomes in terms of climate and development being compatible, but again, only if a few conditions are met. So what are these conditions? Well, first of all, it requires deep structural reforms to reallocate public resources and align development and climate objectives. Second, it requires increased mobilization of private capital and for the private sector to play a very, very large role. While it turns out, which in turn requires, of course, the right enabling environment, the right incentives in terms of prices and regulation. And finally, it requires increased support from the international community to manage, in particular, the large investment needs. So let me just show some results on that. So first number, 1 to 2%. This is the additional investment needs in our CCDR resilient and low carbon development pathways in upper middle income countries compared with alternative development pathways. It includes both resilience and emission reduction policies and investments. So that's 1 to 2% of GDP. In these countries, the main challenge is around aligning existing development spending, reallocating existing subsidies and spending, and providing the right signal to the private sector. In these countries, the private sector, of course, has a major role to play, but also great opportunity to benefit from this transition. And the CCDR has explored these opportunities to grow business and exports in green value chains. But of course, these countries face major political economy obstacles to this transition as well. 2 to 6%. This is the investment needs identified by the CCDRs in lower middle income countries, and it's larger. This is because these countries have larger gaps in infrastructure and other basic services, so they'll need to invest more, and these countries are more vulnerable. For example, investment needs for resilience in Vietnam are quite large, in part due to exposure of its very long coastline. In these countries, continued development is particularly important to ensure that all people have the tools and services they need to adapt to climate change impacts, and of course, to adjust to a lower carbon economy. In these countries, the same challenges exist in the higher income countries. They need to allocate their own resources and mobilize their own private sectors. But these countries face even more difficult conditions to access external finance, and domestic mobilization will also be key. So in some of them, the political economy is even more difficult, especially in fossil fuel exporting countries like Iraq, where the transition is going to be even bigger than in most countries. So external support will be needed to facilitate the transition in these countries, including the strategic use of concessional finance to mobilize private investment and support the transition. The case of South Africa and the challenge of a large reliance on coal is particularly interesting here, and of course is a subject of a lot of discussion at the COP. 8 to 10%. This is the investment needs identified by CCDRs in countries with the lowest income gaps, or with the lowest income, sorry. And here we have countries that are formerly low income or lower income countries with a GDP per capita below $2,000 per year, and the annual investment needs therefore exceed 8% of their GDP. For these countries, the large needs are driven by the climate risks, and they need to adapt to a changing climate and close access and infrastructure gap. So for these countries, external support will play a particularly important role, and these countries will need significant amounts of concessional resources, including through grants to help them transition to more resilience and protect their populations. It's the highest challenge because some of these countries have limited access to external finance, an underdeveloped private sector, and sometimes are in a situation of fragility or conflict. All right, to wrap up, let me just talk a little bit about how the CCDRs provide information on what countries need to focus on most. So the CCDR approach to developing robust recommendations is based on 2 dimensions as shown here. First, we look at the synergies that we can capture with development, and these are shown on the rows. So especially in lower income countries, we want to capture the opportunity offered by green options and technologies. For instance, we want to use the unprecedented opportunities offered by solar panels and mini grids to achieve universal access to electricity, even in the poorest regions of the world. And we also want to boost rural incomes, thanks to better soil management, climate smart agriculture, and forestry. But there are also things that are priorities because they are really urgent, right? As represented by the columns. For instance, countries that are urbanizing fast and have a window of opportunities to do it in ways that are resilient and efficient, should do so now. So the actions that fall in the upper left of this grid, synergetic and urgent actions, are high priority actions that are likely to be part of the key parts of the recommendation. Those in the lower left are urgent but create trade-offs. So the CCDRs generally include additional recommendations to minimize or reduce those trade-offs. For example, through concessional finance. And then those in the upper right are synergetic, but could also be delayed. If capacity exists to implement them, then of course they should be. And lastly, those in the bottom right are less urgent and also introduce trade-offs, and so they should be delayed and studied further before recommending. So with that, I'm going to end my remarks. I hope I didn't go too much over time. Thanks a lot for your attention and look forward to the discussion.
So let's turn to Araceli now. I hope, Araceli, you could hear us well so far.
Yes, I can. I hope you can hear me as well.
Yes, we can.
You can see the slides.
Yeah, we can. If you put in presentation mode, that's perfect. Yes.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much. Good morning, everyone, and pleasure as well from my side to join the discussion today. And these nice colleagues as well in the panel. I think it's a topic, discussing on how we can make the best use of scenario modeling to respond to the different challenges and questions that we are really facing as consumers, but also more importantly in our role to provide advice to governments and different decision makers on what strategies can be put together is really an important discussion to be in. So very pleased to take part of the panel. I've just prepared a couple of slides. In a way, it's a very brief presentation, but I just wanted to give a little bit of a flavor of some aspects that we are kind of intensifying in our analysis to make sure that indeed we can make the most of available resources in a context that as we are facing, which is really an unprecedented one. So first, just quickly starting by a bit of context to really show that as we all know and have been discussing, indeed, we are witnessing this unprecedented shock into the energy system. We were already facing tight energy markets before, unfortunately, we've witnessed as well the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which make just that that situation got much worse. And in here, in this slide, you can see what's the share of countries that are facing an inflation rate that exceeds 6%. And we've seen how really we are at the moment under a situation that is reaching the levels that we've seen in previous crises, but with the difference that is impacting different energy commodities, not only oil, and also at the same time, this increase on inflation has happened in a much faster pace and is impacting particularly more widely economies that are under development, which are more vulnerable to those type of contexts as well. So in that context, we've seen at the same time that many countries, particularly major markets, have put in place clear signals and policy frameworks and support schemes to really move faster in the clean energy transition, with the intention really to reap the benefits from a better energy security, to reduce costs of energy technologies, and at the same time to benefit from the positive impact into the advancements towards fighting climate change. We've seen how since the pandemic, in our analysis, we've estimated that around $1.1 trillion has been spent by governments in clean energy technology since the beginning of the pandemic, as I've mentioned. But of course, these are very positive signs. And as I've mentioned, spread around major markets. I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act from the US has been mentioned already in the introduction. But also, if we think about the Fit for 55 package in the European context, the green transformation program as well in Japan, some of the recent targets in China, but also the solar program in India. So it's quite a kind of a widespread, let's say, momentum or inertia that we are seeing in that respect. However, I mean, when we put this in context of the needs on clean energy technology investments to be on track with this trajectory towards 1.5 degrees, which we explore in our net zero by 2050 scenario, then we see really that much more needs to be done on that respect. And actually, in terms of investments, this would imply an important acceleration. So we will be talking more about a volume of investment that would be around this $4 trillion volume or level by 2030, again, to be on track with such trajectory. At the same time, as I've mentioned before, we need to face this need of accelerating the increase on this type of support in a context where we see increasing geopolitical fragmentation, as it was mentioned before as well. Of course, as looking at the previous slides, we are in a context with inflation which is on the rise. This means basically that how we can face those headwinds imply that we need to work closer and harder together as different countries, different governments, to make sure that we could bring cost of clean energy technologies down quicker. Now, at the IEA, we do quite a lot of energy modeling, technology modeling, as I think this community is certainly very well aware of. And of course, when we looked at the challenge of how to meet net zero emissions by 2050, and using all our modeling tools and frameworks to put them to work, then we really see that there's a need to take action in different sectors across the energy system. There's no exception in that respect. Actually, when we look at how emissions are going to evolve from now to 2030, then we can really see that there is some cases in which we see some actually increases in emissions if we think about intensive industries, heavy industries. But there's clear signals as well that all those positive signs that I've mentioned before, or that supports in terms of clean technology investment, is making its fruits, as we see some reductions in terms of emissions to 2030 moving forward when we talk about coal-based power, certainly in the transition of the mobility, particularly for cars, and also space heating. This is just showing the results based on our STEP scenario, which is more the kind of reference scenario when it comes to the expected evolution of current trends and policies that are in place. Also, the yellow bars show the announced pledges scenario. This is more the scenario in which we also try to understand what will the implications and the impact of all the targets and announcements that have been made by governments, but also by international let's say initiatives that involves also the private sector to understand those market dynamics. But then if we put in the picture the net zero emissions scenario by 2050, that I've mentioned, then we see that, you know, there's a stark difference in the level of ambition when it comes to those emission reductions. I wanted to show this slide because, again, just to make the point that action is needed across the board. At the same time, we all are very much aware that the power sector, in particular coal-based power, is a big elephant in the room in terms of emission reductions that will be required. But there's quite a lot of discussion on the power sector already, and it's been in the debate and the policy debate for a longer time. So I wanted to focus a little bit the discussion, or at least my remarks, to this community today, more in a sector that has been less discussed in that space, which is heavy industries, and for which, despite the volumes of emissions compared to the power sector are smaller, we see actually that, if you see in the slide, is one of the only sectors where we would have to have a change or the reversal of trends to be on the trajectory towards net zero emissions by 2050, compensating the otherwise increase in emissions that we would expect under a, let's say, business as usual scenario, as you see in the slide. So if we go deeper a little bit into the heavy industries, and again, just to give a bit of a flavor of some of the analysis that we do through our scenario modeling, one of the aspects as well is that, as you will be aware of as well, when we talk about heavy industries, we talk about a sector or a group of subsectors. We think about iron steel production, cement production, chemicals production, aluminium, pulp and paper, that are heavily dependent at the moment or present on fossil fuels. This is for specific reasons. First of all, I mean, those sectors required some processes that are highly dependent on very high temperature heat processes. Some of these processes as well entail what we call process emissions, which are basically CO2 emissions that are derived from carbon that is contained in the raw materials or the feedstock that is used in these processes. In most cases, we are talking about very long-lived assets as well, and assets that produce products that are traded in international markets, which again make it a bit more challenging to move faster in a way. So what we see actually is that in terms of where and how to reduce emissions in this type of sectors, again, a menu of options of technology strategies and other types of strategies would be required to reduce drastically emissions in those type of industrial activities. This would range from integrating alternative energy commodities, energy vectors such as hydrogen, different biofuels, but also direct electrification, and would also involve the integration of carbon capture and storage, or also carbon capture for utilization in applications where the CO2 can really be permanently locked into different products. So this spans across a wide range of technology applications, technology designs that we actually track at the design level to understand what is the maturity, what is the readiness level of all of these more than 500 components that we are tracking across the energy sector, to understand whether they are at small prototype stage, whether they are approaching a large demonstration scale, type of step in their innovation cycle, so we can understand where are the gaps in these innovation support schemes, and at the same time how far we are from bringing those technologies to the market, so we could understand the potential rollout and their infrastructure needs. So when we apply this type of framework and design, so we build all this foundation through these tools to monitor this level of maturity of technologies. That one of the tools related to this is called Clean Technology Guide, which can be found in our website as well. We see really that to enable this type of emission reductions, more than half, actually almost 60% in the case of heavy industries, would need to come from technologies that are at prototype or demonstration stage, as you can see in the slide as well. And this is an aspect that is very important for us, very useful to feed into our modeling work, in our modeling analysis when we look at different scenarios, again, to understand what are the most suitable technology options for different regional contexts, depending on the existing infrastructure, the existing fleet of producing assets, what are the different techno-economics involved, and also at what point in time those technologies can be realistically, let's say, available for the market at scale, at commercial scale, when we talk about the individual capacity of one of the plants that is being tried out in these projects. Now, when we face this type of questions, when it comes to heavy industries, as I've mentioned, one of the key, let's say, distinctive features of this sector, even if it's not the only sector affected by this, is that most of these assets are long-lived. Actually, the first starting point for us when we look at how to transform the heavy industrial sectors in different regions is to understand what is the starting point. So what are the characteristics of the existing assets? As an example here, we're just showing this histogram, what is the average age of the most energy intensive assets in the iron steel sector, including blast furnaces, but also direct reduction iron furnaces across regions. So one can understand how much of, let's say, the typical lifetime has been already consumed in a way or completed by those assets. That shows the overall picture globally today. And as I've mentioned, most of these assets tend to operate up to around 40 years, but in some cases, this is more the typical number, but in some cases, this can go much longer, even 60 years. And so this means that when we look at this type of analysis, this basically means that on average, globally, the steel making assets are around 13 to 14 years old, and so far away from completing this 40 years typical lifetime. This is very important to understand and very important to feed into our scenario modeling, because it means that if we don't do anything, if those assets keep operating as they do at the moment, at present, it would mean that we would be emitting the type of emissions that you see in this light purple area, solid area, that shows basically that if we don't do anything, those assets would consume by far the kind of emission budgets that we have let's say, available, or we have to stick to in the net zero emissions by 2050 trajectory when it comes to the heavy industrial sector. So there's no question that we have to tackle those emissions to make sure that we are not outside, let's say, that trajectory. Now, the good news in a way is that even if those assets are long-lived, typically, they normally also undergo an investment cycle every 25 years or so, where they need to do an investment that is of a size comparable to a completely brand new investment. If we think about, for instance, relining a whole blast furnace and replacing some of the burners, this is a very important investment. At which point, I mean, at this point in time, it will be very important to not to miss these opportunity windows, so that if we can coordinate and make sure that those technologies that are being developed can be available for the market, for decision makers, basically, to make practical investment in those, and integrate those technologies in those existing assets, adapt those existing assets so that they can make use of those alternative technologies, then we can make a very important cut in the expected emissions from those existing assets of around 40%. And again, keep the window open so that we can still be on track and we can make or be successful in our endeavor to fulfill this net zero emissions by 2050 goal. So for us, it's very important that all these aspects of analysis, all these aspects of research fit directly into our scenario modeling, so that we can make sure that, again, we understand what is the next investment opportunity of these different fleets and producing assets in different regions, to make sure that, again, we can prioritize our, let's say, advice towards governments on what are the critical technology areas that need a push and need attention when it comes to technology development, to make sure that we don't miss this type of windows. Now, another kind of last point I just wanted to make is that, of course, in a context where we are facing great uncertainty around not only, let's say, energy prices, but also energy supplies, then this type of analysis that I'm showing here in this slide, which is more about understanding what is the sensitivity towards energy costs, energy prices, but also other types of prices like CO2 prices and other regulatory impacts. What's the sensitivity and the response, let's say, how technologies, different routes, producing routes will be affected by different levels of prices across different regions. This is very important, this type of assessments in this current context, so that we can, as I've mentioned before, provide the best advice possible in terms of what could be the solutions that can be more effective economically, but also from a security, from a resilience perspective, and certainly in line and compatible with a CO2 footprint that would be putting us on track towards net zero emissions. In the slide here, I just show one example. We have many of these type of examples that are, again, also fitting into our modeling framework. Here showing what would be the levelized cost of steel production by different process routes, depending again of, different ranges of gas prices, electricity prices, CO2 prices. Again, with the intention to understand what will be more competitive in different regional contexts, and what will be the break-even, let's say, levels that should be targeting via diversification, via regulatory schemes, so that we can make sure that the right technologies that can help us make the step towards net zero can be put in place. And just very briefly, the last point I wanted to make is that, of course, this is very important when it comes to techno-economics, but the other aspects that we are also looking into when it comes to understand what are the technologies that have different roles in different regions in our scenarios is also to understand what are the implications along supply chains. So what are not only the infrastructure needs, so that these developments also go hand in hand with the technology developments and the technology rollout, but also what are the supply chain implications in terms of material requirements, in terms of the pace of scale up of manufacturing capacities that would be required in different regions to fulfill a certain pace of rollout of technologies. And this is an area that we started to look at more intensively over the course of this year with different analytical pieces, particularly on batteries for electric vehicles, but also solar PV supply chains, and that we are working quite intensively at the moment as we are wrapping up the energy technology perspectives edition for next year, that will be published in mid-January. So that's going to focus on supply chains for clean energy technologies, and all of these aspects will be dealt into in that publication. So I will leave it here, but very happy to respond to questions and certainly join the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, Araceli. Before we turn to questions, I would first turn it to our discussant, Brian, for some initial remarks. There's a lot of material, Brian, here, so I'm sure that's.
Yeah, but I know that there are lots of interesting comments and questions that everyone out here has, so I will not take too much time before you can jump in with your own thoughts. And thanks, Max, for inviting me to make a few comments, and to the panel for a great set of really interesting presentations. We saw a bunch of things. I'm not going to get into the details, but I think we overall saw a range of tools, right? Very different tools that are being used here, different types of approaches, different types of scenarios that are being used for these analyses. And for example, on the mitigation side, that allowed us to draw a bunch of different kinds of conclusions that are really useful in a practical sense to the policy challenges we have now about costs, of course, but in some cases also about household impacts, about assets, and so on. In some cases, particularly David's talk, we saw work that integrates impacts into this analysis as well, which then allows drawing these kinds of interesting joint conclusions, as he showed, about synergies and trade-offs that are possible through looking at the combination of policy approaches and the effects of both mitigation and climate impact. So these talks, I think, give you an example of the kind of diverse, sophisticated analyses that we see not just in these talks, but in lots of work that's at the meeting. That said, I wanted to offer just a few thoughts, suggestions, directions. I'm not sure what they are. And this is not to say that these are not being taken in at all in our community. Even in the talks here, we see some of this being done. But I think there are things that maybe would be useful to think about and to push toward with greater emphasis in the community in general. So one is thinking about policy-related analyses. And this has struck me both in this session and the previous session. And the question is, are policy analyses, or maybe better, when are policy analyses too close to the policy community? I think we have a lot of analyses that take the goals that are on the table, right? And this is obviously, clear motivation for doing this, and well justified to say, well, we have policies on the table. We want to decarbonize by this particular year. How can we do it? And that's fine. That's a particular question. It does risk the possibility that, well, what the policy world wants is, look, we've already committed to this. We now need models that show that we can do it, because I have my policy incentives here and I need to be able to demonstrate this. Who can demonstrate it for me? Now, that I don't think is by any means the only dynamic that goes on. It's actually kind of more of a question, is there a sense in which this maybe implicit dynamic over time tends to select for a direction of research that kind of, provides the kinds of answers that are being looked for when there might be a wider range of answers out there? So I'm just going to leave that out there, but it means, not only looking at just transitions, but unjust transitions, looking not only at successful policy cases, but failed policy cases and what happens in those cases. Not just looking at net zero pathways, but ones that are, 3 or 4 degrees, but also ones that aren't based on a target outcome, that are, here's what I think is a plausible set of policies. What happens, rather than doing it the other way around. So that's one thing, is just thinking about the relationship to policy questions. The second is for the kinds of outcomes that we're looking at. And those of you who I've talked to anytime recently, this is sort of a drum that I'm beating currently, is that we, I think in general, we need to be doing as much as we can, both in mitigation and in impact analyses, of modeling all the way through to the outcomes that we actually care about, that are actually motivating the analyses in the first place, right? We're doing this, it reminds me, like Chris Fields back in the last, in AR5 used to say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Right? We have to remember that. And ultimately, we are trying to improve human well-being above and beyond what it otherwise would be for the climate change issue. And yet we often don't model actually all the way through to what happens to human well-being. Now, human well-being is a kind of, a fuzzy concept, but I'm thinking of it as in the well-being literature, it's called objective well-being. And so it's things like food and water security, energy security, health, education, lots of outcomes like that. And so that means that the kinds of outcomes that we see that are good, that we see already, are distributional consequences. That's good. Welfare effects, that's kind of an aggregate version, but that's good. Sometimes, prices, that's okay, but that's not a feature of well-being. That's a determinant of it. So better is going farther to energy burden, to jobs, to property values affected by renewable installations or non-renewable installations. Reliability and for individual households. And I'm just talking about mitigation outcomes here. So that's just another thing to keep in mind, right? And I know it's not that like we're not doing that in some parts of the community, but I think the more the better. And finally, I would say, kind of related, is that I think the more that we can put our climate-related effects, whether it's mitigation consequences for GDP or whatever, or impacts consequences, the more we can put those in the context of the absolute outcomes, the absolute conditions of the world, or changes in the world over time driven by non-climate factors or non-mitigation policies, or not by policies at all, the better, right? So we heard, right, significant impact in David's talk, impacts up to 12% of GDP. That's important, but it's also important, what is GDP in that year? How does it compare to today, right? And this is just for having a better sense of what does the world look like in these scenarios that we're producing. And we have a tendency to look at these marginal or additional effects of climate and tend to confuse them with the total outcomes for the world. And we're like, oh my God, GDP is going to be way down, or poverty or hunger or whatever. And we don't put them in context that where we're mostly talking about climate change slowing down progress rather than climate change worsening absolute conditions. And that's not a blanket statement, right? That doesn't apply to everything, but it applies to a bunch of things related to human well-being in general. So that's the last thing I'll throw in there. It's just something for us to be thinking about when we're framing and carrying out our analyses. Thanks.
So thanks, Brian, for these two main points, which are pretty deep. I would open up now for questions and collect maybe a few if there are, and then go back to the panel for set of remarks. We have about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, please, please, Volker, I think you have to come to the mic so that you can be heard also online by the online participant. Please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the interesting interventions, Volker Kreit from IASA. I had one question that actually relates back to also the previous session, where one of the insights was we need to look into more set of diverse policies and their outcomes, many of which are incentives instead of quantitative goals. To be honest, I mean, carbon pricing, which we all seem to believe we can model, is also an incentive. And I mean, I've seen carbon price outcomes within this session. Was just wondering to which degree we need to do a better job in basically communicating that these are orders of magnitude rather than exact numbers. I mean, looking at the broader literature, I think if we look at correlation between carbon price and quantitative outcomes, there's probably like an order of magnitude or more range in the carbon price corresponding to a single quantitative target. In other words, we don't really know if it's $50 or $500 per ton that we need as a price incentive to get to a certain target. So I was just wondering how this is being picked up in your analysis and communicating these rather broad ranges or orders of magnitude instead of exact results, which is tricky. I mean, for all of us, I guess. And then I had a more specific question to James. I was just wondering, you had emphasized policy packages that are suitable specifically towards not increasing disproportionately the burden on low-income households. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the insights of that research, which in the just transitions context is of course highly relevant. Thanks.
Thanks, Volker. Any other question? Please.
Thank you. This is Wei Pen from Penn State. I want to ask a question about how can we make models more useful for policymakers? Because I think with the modern computing power, there's a tendency among this community to make models more complex, adding more processes, adding more sectors. But I think the panelists demonstrated from some really useful examples that simple models are sometimes more transparent and also useful. So I wonder if the panelists can share your insights on how can we strike the balance of making models characterizing everything, but at the same time also have that simplicity to make it useful.
Any other questions? John. No, we have time. We can cut into the lunch. No,
this is kind of a follow-on to Wei's question. So this has to do, let me ask this neutrally. Is there a problem with the juxtaposition of the top-down and bottom-up models in investment requirements, where the top-down models have capital requirements in the aggregate? And I understand from the CCDR work, one problem with that is when you go to actually finance projects in particularly low-income countries, the cost of capital is generally much, much higher, 2 or 3 times higher than what you might use in a levelized cost curve. So we have these wonderful positive graphs of declines in levelized costs for batteries and PV and whatnot. So the question is, are we, and this was in the Wei Peng et al. Paper, are we actually missing the boat? And it would be pretty easy to fix this, I think, in the actual models, just by having differential cost of capitals in the different subregions in the more aggregated models. So I'll just ask it that way.
Great.
Is that a problem or not?
So we have a long list of questions. Let me also add one on top, which is the most general also ambition of this session is also to look at the current crisis that we saw as affected energy prices, inflation, interest rate, which connects, of course, the financing questions, which have come up regularly and repeatedly. It also affects the choice of policy instruments that have also been discussed in these sessions and in the previous session. So in the spirit of let's not get the crisis go wasted, how can we indeed use this, as also was mentioned en passant by Araceli, to front load or even accelerate or fast track some of the activities in a context of this clear economic fragmentation. So let me go back to the panelists, and I think you can pick whatever ones of these many questions you feel you can, you know, suit your thinking right now more clearly. Just a couple of minutes each, 2-3 minutes each. Let's go backwards this time. So Araceli, David, and James. Araceli, please.
Thanks a lot. No, I think those very interesting remarks and points. Maybe just on the point on precision. I mean, I fully agree with that. I think in a way is the responsibility of all of us as modelers to make sure that when we convey or present a particular piece of analysis, that we do it in such a way that we also make clear that the actual level of certainty or degree of certainty on the results is conveyed appropriately, so that indeed in the way we communicate of, you know, the actual numbers or with decimals or, you know, this more direct precision, but also in the way we kind of set some qualifiers when we describe, you know, some of the conclusions. So it is not easy, indeed, I agree, but also agree that it's a bit, you know, the responsibility that comes with modeling. Simplicity versus complexity, that's another, I think, kind of daily question that we get as modelers as well. I must say that we don't have like a very good solution for this, in the sense that I think in quite some cases, at least within the IAEE context, we ended up with some kind of redundancy of the application when it comes to assessing different questions, because we wanted to have a tool that would be trying to grasp as many nuances as possible, which was in favor or speaking in favor towards more complexity. But at the same time, we need to be reactive and to be quickly, I mean, be able to quickly respond to different needs and to adapt to different changing environments, particularly in the current situation, which calls more for some kind of simplification. And we ended up in some cases having a bit of a dual kind of a combination of the two that could help us understand some aspects with more detail, with a bit more time, so that they could be informing a more kind of simplified set of tools that, you know, could be updated more regularly. But in the end, this also speaks towards greater infrastructure when it comes to modeling, some more resources, more time, etc. So I think there's a bit of a balance, and of course, depending on the type of questions one is to answer and how often that question is to be answered as well. But yeah, I think those elements that were raised are pretty much in the minds, I think, of modeling discussion. So yeah, very much agree.
Thank you. David, please.
All right, great, thanks. Maybe I'll start with Brian, your comments. First of all, I think they were spot on. You know, the question of, you know, how do we model policies, given that those are the sorts of things that need to be implemented, you know, those are the actual decisions that need to be made. It's not how much emissions reductions do we need in a sector. Of course, we need to know that, but it's what needs to change in our governance and in our policies to make that happen. So that is critically important. I would say that I think the design of the CCDR program is really has an eye towards that, and you know, primarily because the intention of the CCDRs is to provide guidance to the bank in terms of what specific projects it should be financing and what specific policies it should be recommending and working with country counterparts to implement. So that's clearly what we're trying to do. And I think that requires at least it does require a bottom-up country-specific look, because you know, you can look at global policies to get an understanding of, you know, where you might focus, you know, at a country level and what you can possibly get from different types of approaches. But if you're talking about implementation, you've got to, of course, look at the details. So I guess I would just, you know, echo that your point there is really important. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to, you know, for the bottom-up approach to be directed by the top-down approach, but you have to keep iterating. In terms of outcomes, I also agree that, you know, we care a lot. I mean, if we're concerned with prosperity and reducing poverty, which is our twin goals at the World Bank, you know, we're concerned with a lot more than GDP. If you're just talking about GDP, as my colleague Brian Walsh says, you're not talking about poor people, you know, and so we have to make sure our models can take the next step and understand, okay, well, what is that GDP implication, or what are the other implications on distributional effects, livelihoods? And that requires different sets of tools. You know, our macro models do not tell you what happens at the individual household level. So one of the things that this community can contribute to, and that we're trying to do at the bank, is couple different types of models. So we bring our, you know, household micro simulation models to better understand how households respond to climate shocks and recover, and what the implication of different policies are. So again, just echoing, agreeing with your comment, and we need help on this and are keen on doing this more. In terms of the second question from the audience, how do we make models useful for policymakers? And this is something that I've thought a lot about in working on problems of deep uncertainty and supporting decision-making under long-term deep uncertain issues. And I think our you know, philosophy kind of comes down to making sure that we, you know, it's helpful to have very refined and detailed models to understand how processes work and systems might function under a particular set of assumptions. But if we just use those to try to predict the future, and therefore choose our policies based on a prediction, we're going to be wrong, and we're going to be blindsided. And so, you know, the types of tools and models that we're using for the CCDRs, just sticking to that example, are kind of a combination of you know, some more prediction-based tools, but also more exploratory tools. You know, what would happen if you did X, Y, and Z under these assumptions? What kind of outcome would you have? And doing that kind of analysis so that you can not predict what's going to happen and maybe identify the optimal policy, but rather understand what are the conditions that need to exist, what are the risks, what are the barriers that can be overcome through other types of interventions. So just some thoughts there. And then lastly, about the top-down versus bottom-up, or I guess sort of the issue about, you know, when you're looking at policies, or I guess like technology curves in developing countries versus developed countries, just wanted to reiterate that, yes, you know, cost of capital is a huge issue in lower income countries, you know, particularly, you know, in Africa. So it's really important to take that into account. And I think that's, again, where there's value in having bottom-up assessments working together with top-down assessments. And so I guess we've learned from bottom-up assessments that can be a real big barrier. So if you're not reflecting it in top-down models, then we're missing something. So we should, you know, work to bring those two approaches together. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. So thanks very much. Great comments and great questions. There was a specific question for me about the incidence analysis. And I'm not sure if I'm answering the question exactly, but within this model, we can look at all different ways that you could you could recycle revenues from carbon taxation in order to address concerns about regressivity. So typically you'd find that even if carbon pricing is affecting poorer households more, you don't need to put, because their overall spending is quite low relative to the richer households, you don't need to devote that much of the overall revenue to be able to fully compensate that, or more than fully compensate that. So we typically look at examples. I think particularly for richer countries, we tend to think about reductions in labor tax or increases in the labor tax threshold as an effective way to recycle the revenues from this point of view. For poorer countries, it may be that investment towards health, education, other SDG goals may actually be the most effective way to use the revenues to help the poor. But it really is something you can play with and model for different countries, and it will be a question for the political political judgment of the country. But I think it's it is a vital thing to be considering in doing a package of reforms like this. On the other questions, I don't think I have very much to add to what the others have said. I mean, from our point of view, the model that I've been presenting, it is extremely simple. I mean, that's a great advantage of the model, I think, is that it's something that's very simple, easy to explain, that you could have a very, but that's exactly because it's based on all the other models. Now, whether all your models that are used, which then we're sort of synthesizing into this model, they need to be complex or not, that's a question I'd say is more for the audience than for me, because we certainly try to keep things simple at our end, but it may require that complication underneath. And on uncertainty, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's absolutely vital to explain the uncertainty and the ranges, that give some idea of the ranges of uncertainty. I think for our work in the fund, again, we have a bit of an advantage in that we tend to be fairly short term. You saw that everything I was presenting was talking about where we need to be between now and 2030. This kind of thing where we have a bit more understanding of how policies are going to go as time horizons get out towards net zero. Things become much more uncertain, and we certainly feel very uncomfortable talking about effects of carbon prices or carbon price equivalents much above 100, 150, this sort of level, because it becomes so uncertain as to what the technology is going to look like and how reactions are going to be at that level. Thanks.
All right, great. So thanks. I think we cut only 9 minutes of your lunches. I hope that is not too much. And thanks. Let's give a big hand to all the speakers. I think it was an exciting session. And although we didn't solve the geopolitical tensions and crises, maybe that will be done over lunch. So I see you just afterwards.